Now, our first conversation will be on PwC's mid-year review and updates H2 2025 economic outlook. Now, in that report, I put out some key points. GDP was rebased to 2029 from the previous 2010. We all know that. Benchmark providing a precise and current representation of the economy's composition. Now, following the rebased GDP, it grew by 3.13% in Q1 of 2025. That's Q1 2024, 2.27%. Now, the highest growing sectors were finance, insurance, ICT, construction, and real estate. Finance and insurance sectors' growth was due to the performance of the banking subsector, 15.91%, supported by higher interest income and increased digital transactions. ICT growth was driven by increased broadband investment and supportive policies that sustained digital adoption. Construction sector growth was also largely driven by government infrastructure spending and private investment in housing and transport. Real estate was driven by increased income from leased and rented properties, growth in urban rented markets, and rising demand for office, retail, and logistics space. It's just some key aspects. A lot is in that document that we need to crack down. Let's understand that document. My guest is Mr. Abiodun Kayode-Alli. He's an economist and tax manager. He works with PricewaterhouseCoopers. He's live in the studio for us to get this done right away. Good afternoon, Mr. Abiodun, and thank you so very much for coming into the studio.
Yeah, good afternoon, Tula, and thank you for having me.
I think it's good we start with an overview of this document because, like I said in my introduction, a lot is in that document. I did a lot of reading and reading. I started with a dashboard, which shows a lot of economic indicators. Yeah, and what do you make of some of those assumptions, those indicators there, looking at where we are now? Any changes? Are we still staying with all of them?
Okay, thank you very much, Tulu. And it's a good question you've asked, right? So on a macro level, right, yes, you can see that most of the macroeconomic factors, like in terms of GDP growth rate, in terms of inflation, in terms of our reserves, right, the things that affect the country as a whole, you can see that Nigeria has made some improvements, right? You see the growth rate at the last financial year, that was 2024, we had a growth rate of about 3.4%, right? Relative increase. Okay, then also in terms of our foreign reserves, currently our foreign reserves has gone back to a record high, about $40 billion, right? So these are some of the things that we've seen, which were achieved as a result of the policies that were put in place by the current administration, right? Yeah. So lots of positives we can say there. If you consider the impact to the people in terms of the micro, right, we know that they did come with some pains, right? But like most economists have said, as well as international organizations, these pains were necessary, right? And they've also advised that Nigeria stays the course. I think one good thing we can also pick from there has to do with the stability of the foreign exchange, right? We've seen a situation whereby the foreign exchange has been hovering around 1,500 for a significant period of time, right? Yeah. I mean, these are some of the things that we were calling for, right? Especially when you look at the difference between the arbitrage in the parallel markets as well as the official rate. There was that wide arbitrage which we had.
It was worrisome, that disparity.
This has been narrowed down to a reasonable level. So it kind of instills confidence to business investors who want to come into the country. And there's no cause for alarm with respect to would they be able to get FX if they want to carry out repatriation, which we had in the previous instances, right? So most of these concerns have been addressed by the policies that the government has put in place right back then. The question which I'm sure you would want to ask and which a lot of people have spoken to is, these are macros. What's the micro impact?
I discussed this yesterday. I said we seem to be getting the macro right, but what about the micro?
That's quite important, because when we look at things from a micro level, GDP growth is good. It's important. But more importantly, from a development economics perspective, you want to look at developments, right? Not just growth. You want to see how it translates. And I think that's a particular points where the current administration is trying, right, but I believe can do much more. So we do give it to the current administration with the policy on the minimum wage, for instance, right, increasing the minimum wage to 70,000, even though we do know that 70,000 currently, it might not be able to go a long way.
Not even up to $50 at the moment.
That's just the point. It won't go a long way in actually addressing most of the concerns of the people, right? So I do think a lot more needs to be done, not just at the national level, but also at the sub-national level, right? You do commend the efforts of the government with policies back in October 2023, like the removal of VAT on most of these essential items, right? Petroleum products, essential items, and also the household subvention that has been given, right? Even though there was the expectation to cover at least 15 million households, right? We know the government has been able to achieve at least 36% of these objectives. So I do think a lot more needs to be done in that regard. And some things are easier to do, some things might take time. I think a lot of focus needs to be done with respect to those that are easier to do. When it comes to things like food, for instance, food inflation is still high, despite the fact that we've kind of rebased our inflation numbers, and we know that inflation numbers have been declining steadily. Even though that doesn't mean that the prices aren't high, when it comes to food inflation, that is still on the increase, right, as a result of insecurity challenges. And it's a good thing that the government has brought different ways to address the issues of insecurity, such as the idea of estate policing, which is not bad in itself, right? If we can, to a large extent, curb insecurity, that would help, right, in ensuring that farmers are able to go to their farms, right? And I think one other one that the policy that has to do with removal of most of these non-state actors who at every point in time collect taxes, right? Issue tickets to drivers who are bringing these food items, right? I think to a large extent, most of these non-state actors can be redeployed, right? These are, if you look at some of these individuals, these are able-bodied men who can be productive in other areas. So if you can collaborate with the states to kind of redefine what these individuals do, that to a large extent will also bring down the prices of food items, because we do understand that there is a lot of taxes most of these food transporters actually have to pay on the way, right? So I think some of these things are things that can be addressed in the short run, right? But apart from that, I think the government can then focus on things like infrastructure and see how it can actually help, right? Create that enabling environment for businesses to actually begin to be more productive. I think if we look at it from that perspective, we can say the government has actually made some commendable strides, but there is still opportunity for improvement.
Indeed, global dynamics are something that I read that aspect of global dynamics, which we cannot ignore. Donald Trump's tariff, the big one there. We've been talking about this for months. Just recently, President Bola Tinubu says, well, Nigeria is also being defensive. We're ready, you know, but all the same, we still need to talk about it. Trade policy uncertainty and all of that is also in this report. How do you see that affecting global GDP projections?
Well, to some extent, Nigeria is not isolated. Nigeria is not isolated. So despite the fact that, and it's commendable, despite the fact that we made reference to being able to achieve our revenue targets without making much borrowing, right? Nigeria will definitely be impacted because most of the items that we actually make use for our manufacturing sector, in terms of production, we have to import a lot of these items, right? So to a large extent, it does impact us, right? And also with respect to policies like the AGOA policy, which were suspended with the introduction of these new tariffs, right? So I do think that as much as possible, it now behoves on government, businesses, and individuals to begin to look for alternatives, right? How they can look for alternative trading partners, as well as look inwardly in terms of meeting some of the raw materials, right? The inputs that is being required for production. So until Nigeria begins to find alternative trade partners, and the Africa Continental Free Trade Area provides that perfect platform for Nigeria to begin to trade with other African nations. But given the fact that most of our trading are still at, would I call it the subsistence level, still at the basic level, the outputs that we produce, I do think that Nigeria should also begin to look at ways in which it can add value to most of its productions, and as well as looking at the US, the other trading partners, right? Like the EU, like Asia, and thankfully the current administration went to Japan, right, with respect to Africa's development, the TICAD program. And I think these are opportunities for Nigeria to begin to work with these partners and see in ways it can attract investors into the country. But apart from going out there, I think one important thing that we also need to do is create that confidence for the Nigerian people, right? Because it's not just the report that is being issued by government officials. We also want to get that report from the people, the Nigerian citizens themselves, right? So I think the government needs to do a lot more in terms of creating that enabling environment and letting its own individuals and citizens satisfy most of the things that it's doing in-house, right? So that's just the way I see it. But like you rightly said, Nigeria would still continue to depend on foreign nationals, yeah.
Oh, of course. Now, CBN's policy stance remains firm, of course, around price, financial system stability, and all of that, not moving away from that core mandate like it used to be, what we used to see in the previous administration at the central bank. Do you think that is the way to go? And if that is the way to go, when do you think that we would start to see a bit of loosening?
Yeah, I think we can expect to see that probably towards the end of the year, right? Because it stands, right? So it's more like a double-edged sword, right? We do know that currently the FX has been stable, like we said, right? We've avoided the situation whereby there is that huge arbitrage between
which is really commendable.
Which has been yes, and even currently, you don't necessarily need to know people, right? You don't necessarily need to know people before you can get access to Forex, right? It's readily available. So I do think that the CBN would continue, along with the members of the Monetary Policy Committee. I think they will continue to hold on to that current stance of 27.5%, even though we do know that it might negatively impact on most businesses, right, like the manufacturing sector. So I think that there is still a lot more gains that can be achieved by still holding on to this stance. Then as other policies from the fiscal side begin to set in, as they begin to kick in, right, then it can begin to loosen its stance in that regards, right? And we've seen policies such as the tax reforms, right, which is expected to kick off on the 1st of January next year. So at that point, when the benefits, right, from such policies begin to kick in, at that point, the CBN can begin to cut down on or loosen its grip with respect to the monetary policy rate currently.
Thank God you touched on that, because I was looking at elements of that new signed tax law, and many are talking about the different versions we get to hear. And one that is trending on the social media now is the 5% petrol tax that will start by 2026. And that said is a part of expected implementation of this tax laws. Can you give us some clarity with regards to that? Because I'm also worried.
Yeah. So one thing I must say is that if you look at the body language of the current administration, I think to some extent, even though they have come with policies which are aimed at setting Nigeria free, right? If I can use that word, or giving Nigeria that freedom, in terms of its resources. I do think to some extent they've done their best, and they are still doing their best to ensure that the sufferings of the average citizen is not heightened. And back in October, 1st of October 2023, that was when they said that VAT would not apply on petroleum products, right? And they suspended VAT on diesel for a long time. So this surcharge, right, the 5% surcharge that you made reference to on fossil fuels, it's something that actually existed, right? Okay. We had it under the FEMA Act, the Federal Emergency Road Maintenance Agency Act, right? So we had it there. But I think the problem there had to do with administering it, collecting the 5% surcharge. So with respect to administration, what the new law that we're expecting to take effect on 1st of January 6 to do is to shift the administration burden over to the tax authorities, which is now the Nigeria Revenue Service, to shift the administration burden. And it's meant to be applied on petroleum products, right, fossil fuels. with the exception of certain products. Some of these products are the renewable energy products, right? Just to ensure that incentivize investment in renewable energy, and also CNG, cooking gas. It's not going to apply on these products, right? But other petroleum products, it would apply at the retail point. So the expectation is that the Minister of Finance, right? The Minister of Finance is meant to come up with an order that would state when this particular collection administration would commence, right? So I think that's one key thing that we need to chip in, right? Because like you said, you've seen it on social media. I've also seen it on social media. But there is a provision that says that the Minister of Finance would actually state when it's to commence. And in addition to that, one other thing that has also been included is that the VAT that we spoke about, right, for petroleum products, there is a provision for the minister to actually state when VAT on petroleum products also should kick in. And there is also the opportunity for the minister to say when it will be suspended, right? So as much as possible, I do think that people should just relax and not be too worried until that particular order takes in. Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
All right, let's wrap this up now. Outlook, you know, we're almost getting to the last quarter of 2025. And really, I think it's time we start to, you know, have those projections and know where we are headed. Broader fiscal policies going beyond revenue generation is part of the recommendations in this document. So let's talk about that as we wrap this up.
Yeah, so I think as much as possible, like we've said, it's good to have those macros and see that Nigeria is doing well for the world to see. But I think more importantly, the citizens of Nigeria should be able to attest to this themselves, right? So beyond the revenue recognition, I think one other thing that the government needs to do is to invest in its capital, right? And from capital, we are looking at it both from human capital as well as natural resources. And I know policies have been put in place to do this, but I think a lot more needs to be done. And institutions are very important, right? So if you think about it, as government is working towards creating policies to develop human capital, it's also, or creating policies to actually ensure that Nigeria is in a better position, it's important that we have good governance as well. There is that alignment, right, between investment in capital as well as alignment with good governance. Because if Nigeria can actually get it right from this perspective, right, we won't just be leading. We won't just be leading. We would also grow, and you'll be able to see this trickle down to the citizen. So I think Nigeria, one thing we need to do is to work on our governance. As long as we can create that institutions that work and ensure that there is good governance, I think to a large extent we'll see Nigeria going forward. There's a lot of optimism in terms of Nigeria's performance.
Mr. Abiodun Kayode-Alli is an economist, tax manager with PricewaterhouseCoopers, breaking down the reports there, H24, from the PricewaterhouseCoopers, looking at the outlook and, of course, happenings in Nigeria's economy. Thank you so much. Thank you for coming in. It's good to see you as always. Thank you so much. Well, still to come on the show.